Hello and welcome to another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, I want to talk Rudy Gobert, what some of the Wolves' issues have been with him on the floor, and what specifically has Rudy been much worse at this season than just last year with Utah and really over the course of his career. I want to dive into those numbers just a bit and then also preview Wolves-Pelicans as the Timberwolves take on a red-hot New Orleans squad on Wednesday night in New Orleans. It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day and happy Timberwolves game day. Thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. This show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, and also on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app. That's on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7. That's absolutely free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today. Again, that's both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And of course, you can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T Wolves. Don't forget the T, and at B Beecken with two B's, two E's, Cken. All right, the Wolves are in New Orleans to take on the Pelicans tonight. The Pelicans are, not just red hot. They've been really good all season and good even despite missing some of their best players, most recently Zion for a longer period of time, Brandon Ingram. We'll get into that later. I think it's an interesting matchup. It's going to be really difficult for the Wolves, of course, still very shorthanded themselves. So we'll break that down here towards the end of the show. I want to start, though, with the Rudy Gobert conversation because it has become the elephant in the room. And I have tried my best to remain relative. Let me start over. I think we're still very much in a wait and see mode in a lot of ways, right? Because the Rudy and Cat sample together is still very small, but the drumbeat is getting louder with the Wolves now 2 games below 500 for the first time in a little while, and we're sneaking up on halfway through the season. Karl-Anthony Towns will not play probably for at least another 3 weeks, based on the timeline the team's given and had been reported nationally. So this team could be 5, 6 games or more below 500 by the time Karl-Anthony Towns returns. And perhaps at that point, I mean, you'd like to think that maybe the pressure's off on the Rudy Cat duo because it's like, well, the season's a bust, whatever. But the pressure won't be off. All eyes will be on Minnesota because if they finish this year spectacularly terribly, then everybody can declare once and for all that this trade was a massive failure, right? But so for that reason, when Towns returns, people are going to still be paying attention, even if it feels like, hey, the Wolves are, for all practical purposes, out of it, which is such a crazy thing to say, here 30 some odd games through the season. And I'm not saying it is now, but if the Wolves are, call it 8 games below 500 when Cat returns and they've got a tough schedule upcoming or whatever, they're below 500 at the All-Star break, that's when the Vultures will circle in earnest, right? It's happening already, and that's when things could get even more difficult. So in the meantime, the Wolves have to stay afloat with Rudy Gobert and no Karl-Anthony Towns, and they mostly did that here for a little while. They went on that mini winning streak, and there was this weird clamoring that, of course, is now absolutely gone, of like this weird kind of murmuring on Twitter about, oh, this team might be better without Towns, which is absurd. And I talked about it on the show at the time, like there's elements of the game that the Wolves are going to be better at without Karl-Anthony Towns. That number one is ball movement, right? Because Ant and D'Lo and these guys all know the ball will come back to them if they move it and there's no Towns. That's not a knock on Towns. That's simply because their best, most efficient offensive player is not on the floor. So of course there's more ball to go around, right? It doesn't mean the offense is better without Karl-Anthony Towns. And we've seen that over the past couple of weeks. And now the Wolves are 4-1 without Rudy Gobert in the lineup. They don't have a winning record without Karl-Anthony Towns, right? So the conversation shifts to, oh, wait a minute, are they better without Rudy? Now, of those 4 games that they've won, I think 3 of them came with no Towns. It was that recent 3-game winning streak. So, they're 3-0 with no Towns and no Rudy, I believe. They're 4-1 with no Gobert in the lineup. And also, if you dive a bit deeper into Gobert's numbers, his only positive net rating pairings, I should say, in terms of 2-man lineups this season, are Kyle Anderson and Jordan McLaughlin. every other two-man pairing for Rudy Gobert is a negative. And you're still talking about the guy who's leading the team in, win shares and has a very, we talked about his real plus minus numbers at ESPN, I think last week. Strong real plus minus numbers, especially defensively, one of the league's best defensive centers still by really all metrics. But his only positive net rating pairings are Kyle Anderson and Jordan McLaughlin. He, of course, hasn't played with McLaughlin much at all recently. And Kyle Anderson, I want to get a little bit more into that one because I think it's really interesting. In fact, let's just do that now. So the Timberwolves as a team are 5-4 without Kyle Anderson. So, I'm not at all saying like, oh, the problem is actually no Kyle Anderson. Like they're a much better team with no Kyle Anderson. That's not true. Or I'm sorry, a much better team with Kyle Anderson. I think they are a better team, but like record wise, again, 5-4 without Anderson, which means they're a game below 500 with him in the lineup. But the starting lineup with both Anderson and Gobert and no Karl-Anthony Towns has actually been good. So if you go to NBA.com/stats and you look at 5-man lineups, right? Still the number one 5-man lineup in terms of minutes played together by far is the preferred starting lineup that includes both Gobert and Towns, right? It's the Russell, Ant, Jaden McDaniels, Towns, Gobert lineup. And that lineup actually has a positive net rating because they were playing better right before the Towns injury. So they're a +4 in terms of net rating this season. The second most played together lineup is now the Townsless starting lineup. So the same lineup, Russell, Edwards, McDaniels, and Gobert, but with Anderson instead of Towns, and only 66 minutes. But again, this is now the second most used 5-man lineup that the Wolves have this season. They're a +11.8 in terms of net rating, which is, it's better than their preferred starting lineup, albeit in plenty less minutes. This is across only 5 games, right? That lineup has only played together with no Towns, but they've started games. They've played 66 minutes together over 5 games, and they're a +11.8. Now, the what is it? The fourth most used lineup fifth most used lineup. Where'd it go? I think it's the 5th most used lineup that has no. Oh, here it is. No Anderson, no Towns. Oh no, it is the 3rd most used lineup now. Okay, so here we go. The 3rd most used lineup this season behind the preferred starting lineup and the preferred starting lineup plus Anderson minus Towns is the lineup we saw in Miami on Wednesday, and that's Austin Rivers in the lineup instead. So it's a small starting lineup of D'Lo, Edwards, Rivers, McDaniels, and Gobert. They played 56 minutes together, and they're a -10.1. So effectively the same amount of time as the Anderson lineup, but with Rivers and no Anderson, they're a -10 versus basically a +12. So we'll call that a 22-point net rating swing in roughly the same amount of minutes. And I don't think it's because Kyle Anderson is that much better of a player than Austin Rivers. I think it's because the fit is that much better. And the rebounding is that much better. I mean, the rebound rate of these particular lineups, believe it or not, actually, the Rivers lineup has a higher rebound rate in those limited minutes. But I think the defensive versatility and also the ability to defensively rebound the ball better, the threat to defensively rebound the ball better is much more significant with Anderson on the floor. So even though that the rebound rates for those specific 5-man lineups don't jive with the size of the players on the floor, I think it's the defensive versatility and also the offensive acumen of Kyle Anderson. Like Austin Rivers can run an offense, but when Anderson was on the floor with that starting lineup, even with Russell and Edwards, Kyle Anderson was operating a lot of the offense. He was initiating a lot of the offense. And what he's able to do at his size and with his passing ability is just a little bit better than what Austin Rivers can do. And that's the biggest difference. And then again, the defensive versatility. So I think, but the biggest gap there is actually the offensive rating and how much better that group is with Anderson on the floor instead of Austin Rivers. He's just a better facilitator. And also when teams play zone, I think having him kind of foray into the middle of the zone and just kind of pick apart a defense, he showed that ability with that lineup. So Kyle Anderson, we'll talk about the Pelicans matchup specifically later, but he's questionable on Wednesday. And I think this starting lineup can win, right? With Anderson at the 4 and McDaniels at the 3, sliding down from where he would, from where he plays if Rivers is in the lineup, which I think is another piece of that, right? McDaniels is just simply better at the 3 than he is at the 4 in a lot of ways. It hides his rebounding deficiencies. He's just on the perimeter a little bit more often, etc. So all that to say, Anderson coming back Wednesday would be huge for the Wolves to have a chance against the Pelicans. But it also shows that, like, hey, Gobert playing against another, even if it is a more of a point forward for in Kyle Anderson, can still be effective with this Wolves team. And it's one of the 2 positive net rating pairings we've seen this season. Jordan McLaughlin being the other one. I want to dive a bit more into Rudy's numbers specifically or individually, I guess, here in a moment. So we're going to do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at PrizePicks. On Wednesday night against the Timberwolves, I would take the Zion Williamson, I'll be honest, over on everything. I don't know what the line is right now over at PrizePicks, or what the number, I guess, is. The player projection is at PrizePicks for Zion, but I'd take the rebounds over. I'd probably take the points over. I don't know how the Wolves are going to slow down Zion. If you want a Wolves player, I don't know. On Wednesday, I probably would take the I don't know. You can look at the Wolves backcourt and you could pick, I'd say maybe the D'Angelo Russell over on field goals made. I think he's going to shoot the ball a lot. And I think he'll get back on track against the Pelicans, given that matchup. PrizePicks is a ton of fun. It's extremely easy to play. Pick 2 to 6 players if they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection. You could also cross sports. So you could pick, college bowl game or something and mix that with your Wolves projection or NBA projection. You can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And again, any sport that you watch is on there. You can make your entries in 60 seconds or less. It really is that easy. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up today and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, they'll give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Now make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today, the biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less, plus instant reactions, game recaps, and Locked On's take of the day, Locked On Sports Today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how Kyle Anderson and Rudy Gobert together have been a good pairing. The 5-man starting lineup is good with both of them in it, even with no Towns. Now, specific to Rudy Gobert, let's talk about how much worse he's been this season than he typically is. And I could run, actually, I'm going to do this real quickly, talk about basically across the board. Both his per game and rate-based stats are all down from where they were in Utah. But there's one specific statistic that I think is really interesting. Not in a good way, but I think points to a lot of a lot of his issues so far this season with the Wolves, and why the perception is, and also the reality, that he just hasn't been as good as he was in Utah. And this is, to be clear, I could probably do a whole show on this, and I probably should just do a deeper dive into the actual film of how he's being used offensively in Minnesota versus where he was in Utah. And there are certainly some differences. I talked about before Towns' injury about using Towns similar to how Utah used Bogdanovich, but obviously as a souped up version of Bojan Bogdanovich, and a version that could do so much more. And Bogdanovich is a really good player, but there's so much more Towns can do. Should the Wolves just kind of replicate what Utah did offensively? Because no, Anthony Edwards isn't Donovan Mitchell, but there's similarities to their games, and there's things that he does better than Donovan Mitchell. And so I think borrowing some from what Quinn Snyder did in Utah, and to be clear, some of the issues at the end in Utah were at the end of that, that group with Mitchell and Gobert and Quinn Snyder, was because they weren't being creative enough offensively. But right now, whatever they were, what they were doing in Utah, that sounds really nice right now, right? Because that was the best regular season team over the last few seasons. So the Wolves right now are below 500. So all that to say, Gobert himself, though, across the board is down pretty much everywhere. His true shooting percentage is way down. In fact, right now, it's his lowest true shooting percentage since the 18-19 season, which was the year prior to the first time he was an all-star, going back way before COVID. It's at 68.6%, which for a center, for Rudy, it's not good. His free throw rate, way down, 0.603. In fact, the lowest free throw rate of his career, going all the way back to when he was seldom used as a rookie, when he became a regular contributor as a second-year player in 14-15. This is the lowest free throw rate of his career. It's a 0.6 right now. And his career rate, including this season, is a 0.73. So he's significantly below that. His defensive rebound rate is down almost 8 points. What is that? 7.6 points, 7.4 points since last season. Defensive rebound rate. The total rebound rate is down almost 4 points. His assist rate right now is the lowest it's been since his rookie season when he was seldom used. The steal rate's actually up slightly, the block rate's down significantly. In fact, it's half of what it was 2 years ago in what was arguably his best season in Utah, the 2021 season. COVID shortened on the front end of that one when he had a 7% block rate. This year, he's 3.5%, by far the worst of his career. By far, not close. Down from 5.7% last year, 7% 2 years ago. The turnover rate, way up. The highest it's been since the 15-16 season before he became a star. This is his highest turnover rate. Usage rate, we've talked about that before on the show. This actually would be his lowest since that same season before he became a star. 15-16, so basically the entirety of his prime in Utah, those 6 years, 3 all-star appearances, a couple of third-team All-NBAs, multiple defensive players of the year, all that. The usage rate is lower than it was that entire time. We could talk field goal percentages, which, true shooting percentage, I think encapsulates that really well. But this is his lowest field goal percentage right now since the 17-18 season. We talked about free throw rate being way down, and, free throw percentage is, slightly below last year, but better than a couple years before that. So that's not a big part of the conversation. But the point here is defensive rebound rate being down. And certainly I'm not faulting this. We talked about this the other day. I'm not faulting Rudy for the Wolves' collective defensive rebound rate issues, because I think it's more the guards and the wings that aren't rebounding their positions. But Rudy's still down from where he was last year. He's still down. In fact, the defensive rebound rate right now is his lowest since the 17-18 season. Now, last year he led the league and he had an insane rebounding year. And this year's not sniffing that, but it's also not sniffing the 2-3 years before that either. So the defensive rebound rate being down, the usage rate, and the block rate is the biggest thing. And this requires a deeper dive to what the Wolves are doing defensively. But by and large, they're playing drop coverage, which is what Utah did pretty much exclusively with Rudy Gobert. So what's the biggest difference, right? To me, it seems like he's a half step slow in rotations. And again, I want to go back and do a further deep dive on, both on the offensive and defensive end on like what's really happening. But if you watch, like the Heat game is a great example. When Rudy was effectively benched for most of the final 6 minutes of the game, Rudy was doing a decent job at stepping up and at least crowding the paint and making, say, Tyler Hero make a decision to shoot a floater, but he wasn't really contesting that floater and he wasn't getting back into position to try and rebound either. There were a couple possessions early in the game where he was contesting, getting to the corner to contest a three. He was showing in the paint, at least making things difficult, tagging a roller, getting out to the perimeter to contest a three. Those are things that admittedly are difficult to ask a 7+ footer to do, but they're things that Rudy Gobert's done throughout his career and had great success doing it. So then the question is, has he lost a step? He's 30 now, which was one of the concerns about this trade and what the Wolves gave up. Is that part of it? Is it a motivation? Is it a motivation thing? Is it a legs thing, right? He played Eurobasket. He's played a lot this season already. He's only missed the 5 games total. Is it he's not yet recovered from Eurobasket. Where does that lie? He didn't suddenly forget how to play defense. He's either his legs aren't there, he's not motivated, or he's just lost a step. Those are really the options. The Wolves are, for all practical purposes, doing very similar or playing very similar defensively to what Utah did with Rudy. And now until recently, right, the Wolves have tried some high wall with Gobert. They've tried a little bit more switching than I think Chris Finch would like to do. And I think then a little more than that frankly makes sense in most situations. But by and large, Rudy's playing drop coverage, and by and large, he's struggling in that drop coverage of the season. The biggest thing to me, though, is Rudy Gobert's field goal percentage at the rim and his putback, we'll call it lack of success on putbacks. His offensive rebound rate is actually up this season. It's to the highest point that it was, going back to 18-19. So the offensive rebound rate is up for Rudy. Now, part of that is a function of he's less involved in the primary action in the offense. The Wolves aren't running as much pick and roll as with Rudy as the screener as Utah did. They just aren't. They're doing a lot of other things, especially when Towns was on the floor. But even now, Rudy's getting, you look at his game log. We talked about this on the postcast with Barney. I think he has 4 games, thrown out the one he was hurt in, ejected in, 4 games this season where he's got 5 or less field goal attempts, which is crazy. Like that didn't happen to him very often in Utah. So he's around the rim a little bit more often in the dunker spot, available for those offensive rebounds. So he's grabbing them at a higher clip, but he's just missing at the rim. If you look at his field goal percentage at the rim so far this season, he's 73.5% from within 3 feet. That would be his lowest percentage since the 17-18 season. Last year, he was over 80%. 2 years ago, he was 79.8%. So The last 2 seasons combined in Utah, he was 80% from within 3 feet. This year, he's 73.5%, which may not sound like a big difference, but it is a big difference. Also, looking at our friends over at B-Ball Index, we could look at his putback points per possession. This season, he's in the 30th percentile league-wide in putback points per possession. Ranks out as a D, 1.04 points per possession. Looking at where he was last season, just last year with Utah, 1.29 points per possession, 98th percentile, grades out as an A+. That's the only play type where his points per possession is down significantly comparing to, league-wide, the points per possession. Basically everywhere else, he's pretty much the same. He's A+ in a lot of categories, A or A+ in a lot of categories. Again, the frequency that he's being used is down, but the efficiency is mostly still there on as a pick and roll roll man would obviously be the primary one. Like pick and roll roll man, he's still 97th percentile in terms of points per possession. Rudy is still effective as long as the point guard doesn't turn the ball over, right? And that goes back to the other piece of the conversation. D'Lo, Ant, Jalen Noel, these guys that are not effectively getting or consistently getting the ball to Rudy as a roller. So Rudy himself has not gotten worse in those situations. Where he has gotten worse is putbacks. Again, 1.04 points per possession, 30th percentile last year, 98th percentile, 1.9 points per possession. He's shooting under 74% at the rim. Last season, the last 2 seasons combined, over 80%. So the rebound rate is up on the offensive end of the floor. The efficiency rate is way down. We talked about the free throw rate being way down. Those things are related too, right? The lack of free throw attempts, the lack of success at the rim for Rudy. Is it fluky? Is it because he's just lost, a half step? Like that shouldn't really affect him at the rim, right? He's not driving and finishing at the rim. It's not like he's an athletic wing that's late stages of his career. He's a big where he's getting the rebound. So why is he not able to put them back? He needs, it's always been a refrain. You listen to Jazz fans, like Rudy didn't dunk enough. He just laid it up, and it's maybe not to the level of like Wiggins or Pekovic, right? Thinking back in Wolves history of guys who needed to just dunk more instead of lay it up. I don't know that that's the problem necessarily. That plays into it, but Rudy in general, he's just got to convert more at the rim. And that doesn't solve all the problems, but that would immediately account for another 2, 3, probably 2 buckets a game. Would help the Wolves as a team, would help Rudy's efficiency, would help the perception of Rudy Gobert. It would up his field goals made, right? It doesn't solve his usage problem in the offense, but it would be a step in the right direction and at least make him useful as a player offensively. Because right now, there's not much different. You look at these games where he has under 10 field goal attempts. What's different besides, what's Rudy giving you offensively that Jared Vanderbilt didn't give you last year? And I talked till I was blue in the face this summer about like, hey, if he just does what Vanderbilt did, but, is a better screener and they use him in pick and roll and, but is better defensively, then obviously this trade's going to work. Well, they're not that much better defensively so far than they were last year. In general, they're really not. They're about the same effectively. And offensively, we're not seeing anything positive from Rudy that's significantly better than what we saw out of Jared Vanderbilt last year. And it's crazy that we're sitting here, in late December saying that, but that's kind of where we're at. So Rudy's got to convert more at the rim. The Wolves need to include him more in the offense, especially with no Karl-Anthony Towns. There's no excuse that they can't figure that out on some level. So, all right, I want to close here today with the Wolves-Pelicans preview. So we're going to do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You get the latest odds and trends for every pro and amateur league out there, from pro football to college bowl season, which is now underway, to, of course, NBA and college basketball and beyond. They've got it all at BetOnline.net. They've got NHL. I mean, they've got more obscure sports too. You name it, they've got it. The Wolves, of course, are pretty significant underdogs at BetOnline. I didn't look at the most updated line, but for Wednesday night, yeah, they're not going to be favored in New Orleans. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline too. They're the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's talk Wolves-Pelicans matchup on Wednesday. New Orleans, I was off on them this season. I thought that they'd be a playoff team. I thought they'd finish I think I had them 7th I had him 8th in the West. So to this point, I've been off. I did not think that I didn't think the synergy between McCollum, Ingram, and Zion would be what it has been. Now, Brandon Ingram's only played in 15 games, I believe, this season. He's been out now for a little while. So who knows when he gets back? I mean, they've actually been better with him out of the lineup. Again, this is another situation. I'm not suggesting the Pelicans are better without Brandon Ingram, but there could be a reacclimation uh, period with both, with all three of McCollum, Ingram, and Zion on the floor. But all that to say, this team has been above 500 all season, or 500 or above, I should say, all season. They were 11-8 when Brandon Ingram got hurt, and then they took off. They won 7 straight games right after Ingram got hurt a few weeks ago. They've won 10 of 14 overall. They had a brief losing streak. Then Zion went out with COVID. They won all 3 games that Zion Williamson missed. He's probable for Wednesday's game against the Wolves, so expect him to play. He made some comment about, like I said enough last year, I'm going to play Wednesday. Herbert Jones, notably, is a preferred starter for them, a regular starter for them. He is questionable due to, I believe, COVID as well. I believe it's health and safety protocols. Brandon Ingram is, of course, still out. So that's kind of the injury report. Herbert Jones is really kind of the only one in question in terms of rotation players. The Pelicans as a team are relatively balanced. They're good offensively. They're good defensively, depending on where you look. They're top, 5-7 in terms of offensive rating and defensive rating. Again, they're balanced overall. They're balanced offensively. They don't take a ton of 3-pointers, but when they do take 3-pointers, they make them. They've got a couple of high volume guys, and then that's kind of it. I mean, CJ McCollum being one of them. He's not one of their more efficient shooters, overall. He's still more of a high volume scorer. But you worry about with Ingram out, it's, Trey Murphy's over 40% from 3 on almost 6 attempts per game. Off the bench, Devontae Graham, that's really all he does. He only plays 15 minutes a game, but he just jacks threes. Like 85% of his shot attempts are 3-pointers, and he's only league average. He's 36.1%. So they've got a handful of guys that shoot him. Jose Alvarado off the bench, kind of a cult hero. He shoots a ton of threes. He's only 35%. But they also don't really have anyone that takes them that doesn't make them. Like Zion shoots less than 1 per game. He's 33%. For the most part, like Herbert Jones is the only rotation player that takes a decent number of threes and shoots below league average. Everyone else is league average or better. And they're just kind of judicious with their 3-point attempts. And so much is generated off of Zion, penetrating and just kind of bowling his way to the rim. And the Pelicans can play, in a sense, inside out in that way and have a lot of success. Even with no Ingram, Larry Nance is another example of a really good role player. He's coming off the bench for them, but only takes 1 3 per game, but he's shooting 40%, right? Which is, kind of like what Kyle Anderson was doing for a long time for the Wolves. They're kind of middle of the pack everywhere, or better, I should say. They're better than middle of the pack. They're just kind of like, they're not awesome at anything. They're not like top 3 at anything or bottom 10 at anything at all. They get to the line a lot. That'll be key for the Wolves. Minnesota's been fouling a lot again recently. I guess not as much in the Miami game, but New Orleans is 9th at free throw rate. That's a huge part of Zion's game, obviously. So that's an area the Wolves will have to kind of shore up. They're also 6th in offensive rebound rate. You look at some of the guys they've got from Jonas Valanciunas being, first and foremost, you got to worry about Zion himself as an offensive rebounder, Larry Nance. They've got a ton of guys who can just grab offensive boards. So that, to me, is the number one key for this game. Can the Wolves be competitive on the glass? Can Rudy Gobert, A, stay out of foul trouble, and B, which he mostly has lately. I don't think he picked up a foul, actually, against the Heat, which is worrisome for another conversation related to aggressiveness with Rudy, and also related to why he got benched at the end of that game. The Wolves need to be physical on the glass. They need McDaniels and Gobert to stay out of foul trouble. They need Naz Reid to bring his rebounding shoes to this game because, like, he's been much better this season. He had the double-double, 11 rebounds against Miami. Great. The Wolves were a +2 on the glass. Still gave up a bunch of offensive rebounds to the Heat. They can't do that to New Orleans. If they force misses on the perimeter, if they force misses, maybe Zion's a little rusty after not playing in a week plus, they have to secure defensive rebounds. And I could say this coming in every single game this year, but against New Orleans, it's ultra important because, again, they don't shoot a ton of threes, but they make them when they do. So if they miss, period, you got to get a rebound because otherwise you're talking Zion, you're talking Valanciunas, you're talking Nance getting putback baskets or kicking it out to open solid 3-point shooters. Virtually everyone in this rotation is an average or better 3-point shooter. So securing defensive rebounds is first and foremost the most important thing in this game. Second would be the free throw rate that I mentioned, earlier. They're top 10 in free throw rate. So defensive free throw rate, I should say, is avoiding fouling. The Pelicans do a great job at getting to the line. Can the Wolves avoid that? The McCollum matchup will be interesting. I think the Wolves could get away with having Russell on him at times, but with no Ingram, I think McDaniels is kind of the go-to option. And then what do you do with Zion? How are the Wolves going to defend Zion? Or do they put McDaniels on Zion and tell D'Lo or, Austin Rivers, actually, that's probably what they'll do. If Kyle Anderson doesn't play, I would imagine it's Austin Rivers guarding CJ McCollum primarily, and they put McDaniels on Zion and just kind of say, hey, do your best to stay out of foul trouble. We'll see what happens. If Kyle Anderson plays, I think Anderson probably guards Zion for a significant period of time, and McDaniels is on McCollum. But, if Ingram was playing, then you'd have to have Anthony Edwards probably guard Ingram or McCollum. They could give a shot on McCollum too, but, his shooting percentages haven't been great this season. He's scoring 19 a game, but he's only 41% from the field, 36.5% from three. He's their primary perimeter threat, though. So, again, I think it's some combination of McDaniels. If Anderson plays, McDaniels, Anderson, to a lesser extent, Rivers and Edwards that are tasked with guarding those, the Pelicans' best offensive players. There's no Anderson. I think it's McDaniels and Zion and Rivers and or Edwards checking McCollum. So number one key, defensive rebounding, avoiding those second chance opportunities for New Orleans, those kick out threes, those put back dunks by, Nance and Valanciunas and Zion, free throw rate. And then for the Wolves offensively, just get some sort of a flow. Like, the Pelicans are a good defensive team. They're just solid all the way around. They're a good rebounding team. They force turnovers at a relatively high clip. And, they don't foul a ton. Like, they're just a solid defensive team. And can the Wolves find a way to have success offensively? I think that's the bigger thing to watch in this game. If they can hold their own on the defensive glass, then they've got to just do something offensively. And I don't know. I feel like we've been saying that all season, but that's kind of where we're still at. All right, that's all we have for you today here on the show. We'll, of course, do the live postcast with Marnie this evening following Wolves-Pelicans, so be sure to tune into that on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel, or after the fact, we post the audio on all the Locked On Wolves feeds, as well as on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. So be sure to go check that out. A big thank you for watching or for listening to the show and for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, you can listen to the show on any audio platform, whichever one you prefer. You can also watch the show on YouTube or on the Locked On Sports Minnesota Roku or Amazon Fire TV app. Of course, you can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken. That's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. You can also make Locked On Sports Today your second listen. Peter Bukowski brings you the biggest stories from around the sports world in 20 minutes. Get the analysis and opinions before anyone else with our local and national experts and insiders. Locked On Sports Today podcast, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.